Welcome. Welcome back. We are going to start our next session, your role in watershed planning. Michelle Overholser will be doing this presentation, and I will let her introduce herself and get started.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Michelle Overholser. I'm the administrator with the Yellow Medicine River Watershed District. And I'm going to just kind of cover what your role in watershed planning is here, dive in a little bit deeper into the prioritizing, the targeting, and the measurable goals in creating a plan, and just kind of talk about what goes into a really good plan. I'm going to touch on a few things that people earlier touched on, but that shouldn't be a problem, and we'll just kind of dive in from there. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat. We can either get through them as we're going along, or I have set up kind of everything in a couple of different sections, and I will ask for questions at the end of that if anybody has any, so that we're not kind of waiting until the end and we can kind of cover them as they're coming up. So really, when we're all talking about creating these plans and everything, and I'm really kind of going to explain this whole planning process kind of in a one watershed, one plan situation, since that's really what we're all moving to. All of us are in different stages. To give you a little teeny background, the Yellow Medicine itself, we are in the implementation phase. We were one of the pilots. Our plan was approved in 2016. We started implementation and got our first grant in 2018. We are currently wrapping up our first grant, implementing in our second grant, and should be submitting our work plan for our third grant coming up here shortly. So we're all doing this so that ultimately we can implement projects, so that we can move that needle, we can actually start to make an impact in whatever the goals are in our individual watershed districts, whether that is mitigating altered hydrology for flooding purposes, water quality issues, water quantity issues. Every individual district is going to have different priority needs and everything. But the goal of having the plans is to actually put practices on the ground, and hopefully we're going to see some major improvements in this. One of the things, though, in order to implement, you have to have a good plan. It makes it so much easier. And planning process can be a little daunting, but it is extremely important when it comes down to finally getting implementation going. And so implementation really needs the backbone of a good plan. Really, when you begin, it sounds redundant, but you almost kind of have to plan to write a plan. The planning process, there's a lot to it. There's a lot of pieces, and there's a lot of things to consider for everybody when you're writing. These were just kind of some like key bullet points that I came up with. But looking at our land and water resources and uses, because that's going to be different for everybody. Who are the people we're planning for? Who are our constituents? Who are our land users? And we need to gather information, data, and everything, and we have to build those relationships. We're going to be working with a lot of different agencies that maybe we didn't work with as closely before, or maybe we didn't work with at all. And so that piece is extremely important when it comes to a smooth implementation. So your land and water resource uses. I mean, really looking at, what is your current geography, your topography? What are your current conditions of your water quality? Do you have any unique or special resource concerns? Some people might have an endangered species they're really worried about, or a trout stream. Not everybody's going to have that. And that really leads back to what Kevin was talking about with the locally led plans. Different areas are going to have different concerns. And so knowing what those are going in will help you write a better plan. Collecting the data, having your RAPs. What's the current conditions of your waterways? What's your current pollutant loads? there's data that you might not even have thought about that you might need. One that we found was really important to have and really helped ease our process was culvert inventory. Made things a lot easier for us if we could get where get all those locations where water is moving that maybe doesn't show up on some of the maps, the LiDAR data, things like that. You know, that data will see a road there and kind of creates like a visual dam as far as like models are concerned and everything. So having that inventory was very important for us. I could see it being important for a lot of other people, but there's going to be different things for different individuals and for different areas. And then identifying where those data gaps are. What do we need to collect? Is there things we should focus on and make sure that as we're writing this plan, we're getting that data together. And getting all that together will help us identify where our problems are and possibly where the sources of those problems are. Land use is going to be a big part. We all come from different locations. What has been done on the land that has changed the hydraulical situations and everything, which determines where we currently are sitting. Do we have drainage systems? How many of them? How much does that impact our waterway? Is there going to be a big development coming up? Do we need to consider that in our plan? Major roadway construction going to be happening. Crop data, if you're not a metro area, where your impervious surfaces are. Fish and wildlife areas, water and land recreation areas. Some areas are really going to be planning around lakes and using those water resources, those lake resources for recreational purposes. Other areas, that's not such a big concern. So really identifying what the land in your area is being used for. The next thing to really think about and consider is, I mean, who are the people that are using the land and what are going to be their concerns? Getting kind of a handle on that and identifying those concerns when you're going into writing your plan can really help understanding the values and the motivations for the group of people that maybe aren't going to be in the plan writing process, but are going to be looking and watching at this. You know, we talked a little bit about some of the funding and the legacy funds and stuff. You know, we're going to have to depend on the taxpayers to vote those back in 13 years. And that's really not that far away. And so really considering what is important to the people and knowing what kind of struggles we might have going in. I mean, you might have a large watershed district that has a robust urban population, but you have a lot of rural area. That big population in that urban area is going to have different values or see different needs than what your rural population is. And to figure out how to get those conversations to kind of happen, to see so everybody can see where the other side is at. Areas are going to have a lake that is a really big concern, possibly to people who are living on the lake, but might not be the people who are not. And understanding those values, understanding where everybody is coming to, and maybe how you can kind of help get everybody to understand and see where the other side is coming from, and where everybody wants to get. This is supposed to be a plan for the watershed as a whole, and it can become really interesting tying all of that together and getting all those different groups to work together. So a big part of that is gathering the information, building the relationships. You know, we want these plans to be formed by existing science studies and projects. We want to be able to share data. one thing that I'd mentioned earlier that we found that was helpful for our plan was a culvert inventory. When the first watershed districts and SWCDs got together, we were just kind of like, well, we don't have that data, and started to gather it ourselves. Came to find out a little bit down the line that if we would have opened up conversations maybe a little bit earlier with the highway departments, county and state, a lot of that data had already been gathered by other agencies. And now we are repeating the work of work that's already been done. And we're really trying to not do that whenever possible. All of us are funded by taxpayer dollars. And the more we can share data and bring all of that information to the table together, the more streamlined this process is, and the more money ultimately we can end up putting in practices on the ground, which is, I think, is what we all really want to see it. We'd rather see the money going straight into practices than into agency personnel. And so you get all these different groups together. They're important for writing the plan. The policy committee isn't always the group. They're going to be making a lot of the decisions, or the joint powers, and I'm going to jump into them in a little bit more in a minute here. But they're going to rely on the different groups to bring them that data and that information. And we're going to need to provide feedback to the plan writer. We all work in the area. We know that information. And these plans should not be cookie cutter. The same plan isn't going to work for me that works for the Red River Valley, nor for the Metro, nor for Duluth. They need to be set up for our individual areas and what's important to our local priorities and our local needs. So part of this gathering information and building relationships is really kind of putting together some of these committees. I heard it talked about earlier, and we're going to have, a citizen advisory committee. And we want to pull these from as many different areas of the watershed that you can. Could be lake associations. It could be township boards, Pheasants Forever, service groups. We've had 4-H groups get involved. We've had Boy Scouts get involved, Girl Scouts. And it could just be individuals who have an interest. Maybe they've been working with MPCA and doing volunteering water monitoring for years, and we never really even knew about them, but we start all talking and bringing this to the table, and we can really get a lot of different ideas and opinions. So our steering team is going to be like our staff. They're going to work as our coordinators, the daily contacts of the plan. They're going to be your SWCD administrators, your watershed district administrators. We've always invited the DNR area hydrologist to join our meetings. It really helps us with that too. Bowser staff, bringing in those agency staff have helped us with as we're talking about something, or we have some grand ideas that we're going to be sending to the policymakers. If we're discussing these and getting together our recommendations, having some of those other people in the room, I mean, we've been stopped in our tracks before that just said, that sounds wonderful, and I think you guys have a great idea, but no way is DNR ever going to let that fly. So not taking too many steps and getting too far ahead of ourselves, knowing that we're just going to get shut down in the long term. And so the more of those resources and the more heads you can bring into that for those ideas, the better. Your technical advisory committee. This is going to be the people that actually have that technical and that scientific knowledge. And again, this could be your DNR hydrologist. This could be your SWCD technicians, your engineering agencies, your watershed engineer or watershed technicians. Could also be administrators. Some of the administrators have great technical abilities. but identifying who those are and who those people are that can help advise on those feasibilities of the projects that you're going to be looking at and what your priorities are going to be as you're moving forward in your planning process. And then you're going to have your policy committee, and these are going to be your decision makers. Um, they're going to take the recommendations of the steering team, the technical group, the citizen advisory group, and make decisions about what's going to go in the plan. So the better you can come together and give them the best advice, the better your plan's going to look at. Now, this policy committee is usually made up of, a board member from each organization that's involved. That can be it's almost always the watershed district and the SWCDs. It could also be a tribal organization. This might look like with a memorandum of agreement. You might have decided to do a joint powers. There's no right or wrong way to set these up. It's really what works best for your area and for everybody that's involved. And then this committee is responsible for reporting back to all the different organizations. Some plans might have one county, one SWCD, one watershed district involved. I think we're pretty common in our number. We have 4 counties for SWCDs, and we have area 2 with 10 partner organizations. I've heard of others that have 14 to 16 partner organizations. So it's really important to kind of, get all those together, and then that one individual can go report back to the full board, and let everybody help on that board, the county commissioners or whatever it is, help guide them if they're looking at a certain priority or something. So that was just kind of a quick summary of planning to plan, and it is kind of important. The more you can get together and come together on where you're going with this plan, the better your plan's going to be. I will ask for questions if there is any. I don't think I can see the chat box right now, but if there is anything, yeah, you can let me know. Oh, closer to the microphone. Sorry. If there's anything else like that, you can definitely let me know. I don't see anything. So
Hey, Michelle, this is Kevin. I have a question
Yeah.
for you.
Yes.
Could you maybe expand on or elaborate on like how working through the comprehensive watershed planning with one watershed one plan has worked as a, specific for Yellow Medicine Watershed District? And thinking about, has it aligned well? Has there been challenges? Where has it presented new opportunities that maybe you hadn't seen otherwise?
Yeah, so I wasn't the administrator when we started with the plan, but I was actually part of the technical advisory committee. And one thing that I saw from moving from planning process towards the beginning to the end was when things first started out, it was really hard to get over those traditional local government boundaries. It wasn't so much difficult for the watershed district. We've always worked in 3 different counties, but for SWCDs and for counties, they've always worked on their county line. And so conversations at the beginning would be starting out, what about my county? What about my county? How much money is my county going to get? And by building those relationships and really having some of those hard discussions, it really is now to a point where that's not ever even a conversation. It is what is best for the watershed district and what is going to, and I kind of have a little bit on that when we were talking about the prioritizing of where we're going to do this. And that was one evolution that I saw that I thought was really great to see. And it was really a little bit challenging, a little bit difficult. And I've heard some of that from other areas that are going through the planning process right now, but that also is kind of a common challenge.
Great, thanks.
So when it comes to prioritizing, really, we're prioritizing on what do we want to happen, and prioritizing is really just ranking at any and all scales. Where are the locations our priority resources, and what are our most pressing problems, our root causes? Where are our opportunities, and where are our major problems that we're facing? And it can be a little bit difficult because you have all of these parties involved, and figuring out what our priorities are going to be. They're different for different organizations. They're different for different people in the watershed district. In my area, we have a very rapidly changing elevation and sloping landscape in the headwaters. Then we run into a zone where everything starts to transition and moves flat, and then we have floodplains. So what we're seeing as the priorities maybe from the headwaters isn't necessarily what the people who are being flooded yearly would see as the same thing. So coming to terms on that, of what we're going to list in the plan as what our priorities are and what we want to see happen, is part of that building relationships in the beginning and figuring out how we can all come together and agree on where to begin. Because if we don't know what our priorities are, if we don't know what we want to see our outcomes as, how can we really write a plan? So it's really balancing that and giving everybody a little bit of something. We've probably all heard it before in negotiations. If you have, multiple parties that come to the table and one party walks away and is thrilled, it's probably not the right decision. Everybody kind of has to give, and everybody's going to have to take. But it is important that everybody feels like that they're getting something. And that will help everybody come together as a group. One thing that we did is we kind of started out really looking at what is the vision for our watershed. We weren't ranking anything. We were just saying, what is our visions? What do we want to see? We want to see healthy soil. We want clean water. We want to be able to swim in the lakes. Drinking water is pretty important to most of us. And just really what that means. So we started with visions and kind of a vision statement. And moving from there, kind of set that even more to, a simple. Okay, we're having flooding issues in some places. In some places, we're actually not getting enough water. It was drying up in the summer. So we're flooding in the spring and drying up in the summer. So we want to reduce those peak flows and increase our base flows. We want to improve water quality. Everybody wants to protect groundwater. It's just becoming more and more of a forefront in water planning now. And there's new stuff coming up all over, how we're going to integrate groundwater more into these plans. Some of these early plans didn't have a huge groundwater component in them. And so when we broke these down of what our priority concerns are, now it's trying to figure out, okay, well, we care about all these, but where are we really going to just put that, and how are we going to put it? And you should be able to see this a little bit. One thing that we found through discussions, and still, we're not putting in an order of preference yet. And we never really did put in an order of preference. We ended up with 3 priority areas of concern. Now, mitigated alter hydrology and minimized flooding is listed as priority concern 1, but nobody is saying that that priority is ranked above minimizing the transport of sediment and excess nutrients and bacteria, or protecting and preserving groundwater. A lot of practices and are going to benefit and treat a lot of these issues all at one time. So really just coming up with those core priorities. So and there's different ways to do that. One of the exercise that we utilized is you can kind of see the little tags on should be on the right hand of your screen there, that have, different concerns people had. In ag land, we're worried about bank erosion, soil health, soil erosion. And habitats, worried about wildlife and recreation, wetlands, flood stages. And everybody was given these little colored dots and just told, take your dots and go put them on what is most important to you. And things popped pretty quickly. And there were some people that were just completely floored. Like they thought lakes were going to be like the #1 priority. And in some areas they might be. In my area, we don't have a lot of recreational lakes. And, the fact that nobody else thought that ended up being a conversation. Lakes are so important to me. Why are they not to anybody else? And so having that conversation of where everybody else's priorities are can kind of help you kind of understand and see other people's point of views, and really help. So we're not debating and arguing over what the priority will be, but more sharing our different expertise and our different outlooks.
Michelle, there's a question in the chat.
Yes.
Let's see if I'm understanding this correctly. Each watershed should sit down and do this, prioritize, target, and measure. Once a plan has been developed, then will the One Watershed, One Plan implement it?
Well, the prioritizing and the targeting and the measurables is all what you're going to be writing into your plan. And so, yes, everybody does need to have priorities. They need to have prioritized areas, and they need to have prioritized goals. And then targeting comes after you have your priorities. And that all has to be specified out in that plan. When you come to, and I'll be talking about implementation after lunch, when you come to implementing and you have your comprehensive plans and you have your grants and everything, you pretty much have to be able to tie in what you're spending money on into something that was written into your plan. And a justification of why you built that practice where you did. And that's where your prioritizing and your targeting is really going to be coming in, is we put a wetland restoration there because increasing flood holding capacity is a priority goal in our area. It's in a priority sub-watershed, and that was in, that's one of our targeted best management practices.
I wonder, can I interrupt, try to make it a little clearer what I'm trying to understand. I'm just wondering, so sitting down and looking at, prioritizing and then targeting and putting together a plan, that's something that we should be doing at the local watershed. And then I'm wondering, with this new One Watershed, One Plan, then will it work so where like the local watershed does all the priority or legwork and then goes to the One Watershed, One Plan, and that kind of gets implemented from there? I don't know, maybe I'm not making sense.
Yeah, you know what? I might be answering some of that, making that clearer as the presentations go on here.
Oh, okay.
And
So-
maybe I can help address that a little bit, Michelle, just to provide some context. This is Kevin again. The partnership I mean, you can look at it in this one in a couple of ways. As an individual watershed district, if you look at 103D and 103B, if you're in the metro, it talks about, there's planned content, and it talks about prioritization of resources and identifying goals and objectives. Very similar to what Michelle's talking about with your prioritization and your targeting and your measuring. So if you think about your prioritization is your broad, what are your issues? Your targeting is of which areas within your watershed or sub-watersheds are those areas of greatest concern to address those priority issues. And then your measurement is what's done to show progress. That is built within your comprehensive watershed management plan. So one watershed, one plan, if you want to consider it as the program, comprehensive watershed management plan is what you're developing as a partnership of local units of government to implement. And you're working collaboratively to identify those, who's going to implement them. So if you come together, however frequently, and say, here's our priority 1, 2, and 3, which entities are going to do it, and what are our funding sources? Some of it might be state funding, some of them might be local unit of government funding, maybe have other grants through federal government or whatever else that you might be pursuing. But then you're still continuing to work as that collaborative partnership. Does that help?
Very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Evan. And everybody is going to set these up and decide how to do it just a little bit different. And part of this is looking at what the data says and what the scientific data says. So I just wanted to show this example, and I'm not going to go into science too deep here or anything. But if you look on this slide here, here's data that we got back. The TSS is total solids, total nitrogen, and the total phosphorus, and the relative hydrologic alteration. And so this was all modeled, and red being the ones that probably need to be worked on the most, green not. And when we did this analysis, and we were selecting areas that we were going to put as our priority areas, and our priority areas are kind of like where we're going to start first. Because you set a priority goal to start out with, or a priority area, it doesn't mean it has to stay that way. These plans can be changed. You can amend them later on and say, maybe we did everything we think we can do in one sub watershed, and now we want to put another sub watershed as a goal. But you can have different reasons for picking something. We didn't just pick every red one off the map. We looked at other different social factors, economic factors. If there was other things going on in that area that the model doesn't know about, leveraging existing efforts. So we had some big long-term projects that were starting out in one of the headwater sub watersheds, and we wanted to make sure included those. So you can kind of just see briefly on these. It looks like there's a lot of red. The south west over there is our headwaters. We flow northeast, and yeah, there was a lot of red, but not in every single one. And this is what our priority sub watersheds ended up looking like. Were in the ones in the purple. And one of the things we asked ourselves when we were determining this, because you have to scale it down a little bit so that you can say that we picked priorities. Not we're just going to do everything everywhere. And we decided as a group to kind of start at the top. That was a lot of what the data was giving us too. And what makes sense. And for us, that makes sense to put a lot of work down into the floodplains when we haven't done anything to slow the water down in the headlands didn't really make a lot of sense. We might fix more of our problems than we realize by starting upstream. And then we also wanted to make sure that everybody had a stake in the game, so that every county that we were working with had some priority sub-watersheds in there. And that's important for multiple reasons. One, so everybody stays involved. We could have just decided to all start up in the headlands and we would have only had 2 counties involved, and everybody else, would have maybe gotten a priority sub watershed, 2 years down the road, or could have been 5, could have been 10, the life of the plan. And we wouldn't want that to happen because then people start to become disengaged. They don't keep coming to meetings, they don't stay active. And it was important for us to make sure that that conversation keeps happening constantly. And it did work really well. And it has been working. And yes, most of our funding right now is being spent in Lincoln County. And we do not hear a lot of, negative from Yellow Medicine or Lion. They realize that eventually those benefits are really going to start being shown to them because what goes on upstream affects everybody downstream. And that's why this one watershed, one plan working on this scale really makes sense, because the water doesn't really care where that county line is. It's going to keep going. And so really working across those arbitrary political boundaries should benefit everybody in the long term. It might not feel that way necessarily in the short term if you're just looking at the dollars and cents and what's being spent in that boundary. But that's not really what matters. It's really how we're moving that needle overall, which will benefit everybody. So just to recap just slightly, so really prioritizing is just kind of figuring out where are your resources? What are the outcomes you want? And where are we going to start this process? I'll talk about targeting practices next and how we're going to hone in on that a little bit more. If anybody has any other questions right now, I will take it. Don't think I see anything. Keep moving. So targeting really is, we got our priorities. We figured out, what we want to fix, whether that's flooding, water quality, water quantity, could be both. It is both in our plans. So now what do we need to do to fix the issue? What are those practices? And there's different things to consider in that. Is the practice going to address the issue? Is the practice maybe going to address multiple issues? Is it cost effective? Do we have landowners that are going to be willing to do it? There are practices out there where you get very little landowner buy-in on them, and it's probably not your best spot, but maybe you still want them listed as a BMP in your plan. Your time and resources needed, locations, and your most pressing problems. One example of this that I can pull from our plan, which kind of goes into the feasibility and the cost effectiveness, is so our rivers have a lot of sediment in them in my area. I believe that's true for a lot of different areas in the state, but one thing that we decided not to do was to not put stream bank stabilization as a priority best management practice in our plan. It's extremely expensive. We all know that stream bank erosion does contribute a lot of sediment into our riverways, but it wasn't very feasible for us. For one, we're not going to get DNR to just let us riprap all the rivers, and that's not practical anyway, not in our landscape. It's extremely expensive. Small riprap projects to protect infrastructure, things like that. Yes, we support them. We will not pay for them out of our plan money, but we will help with technical availability, things like that. We will help find other ways to pay for them. This isn't the only funding source that can be used in your watershed district. It's just the one that It just when we're using these fundings, we want to make sure that we have a line item in our plan that we can tie this funding to, so that we can say we approve this project because our plan says that we are going to fix this. And I kind of have an example of that here coming up too. So when you're looking at the priority concerns, so again, I'm using examples from our plan, and every plan is going to look different and should look different. But one of our priority concerns was to mitigate altered hydrology and minimize flooding. So the question was, okay, so how are we going to do that? What would do that? Okay, we're going to add acre feet of storage for stormwater. We're going to try to, not increase our peak flows. And we're going to increase our dry season base flow. So we came up with kind of like the goals. So what would be our goals that would meet our concerns? Now, what practices are actually going to achieve that? If we want to, add acre feet of storage, what can we do to do that? And so looking at the individual practices, you have all kinds of different options. Reduced tillage, cover crops, wetland restorations, buffer zones. That buffers were addressed in our plan, just as a, helping to achieve 100% compliance with the buffer law, which I think most people have achieved by now. But again, we were writing this in 2015 when the buffer law was brand new. So that was a little bit controversy in our plan, but it's all ended up working now. And so it's targeting what those practices are and where we're going to put those practices. So we've seen in the past, and not to say that this is, a bad thing, but often when we were putting practices in, and this is just as conservation as a whole, sometimes it was first come, first serve. You had funding, you had a willing landowner, it was an appropriate place for a project, so you put it in. Now here's an example of, there's an impaired reach listed, it's in the red in this river system. Sure, you've got conservation practices going in the green stars, but is it really addressing that issue? In the targeting measures, you're figuring out exactly where you want to put these practices and what those practices should be to achieve the goal in that reach. So now you're putting them upstream from there, and hopefully you're going to see an improvement along that reach. Now there's different ways to target, but again, we want this to be, science-based. There is tons of models out there. These are the ones, well, I don't think there's these are the ones that are most commonly used for me that we've done the SAMS, which is the Scenario Application Manager, and ACPF, which is Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework. These are both computer programs, desktop. They could be run by an independent engineer. You could train staff to run them. More and more offices are now also using PTM app, which I do not have a lot of experience with myself, but hopefully our watershed will be getting it eventually. It's been kind of in the works for a little while, but that's a whole nother topic. And so SAMS really kind of helped us target at a sub-watershed scale. We used HUC 12, and what exactly that means doesn't really matter, but it's a smaller sub-watershed scale, so that we're looking at small pieces at one time. And that's one thing that helped us with our figuring out where our priority sub-watersheds were going to be. And then the ACPF took that a step further and actually gave us a map of practices on the ground. And so you can see in the little red lines are sediment and control basins. The green lines there are grass waterways, and then the circle blue and everything are possible basins that could be restored. Now, just because they put a line on a map does not mean that we want to necessarily put a practice in there. Not everything is going to be feasible. And you have to look at the feasibility. You have to weigh these things between what is cost effective with the dollars that we're using, but also what a landowner is going to be willing to do and what is effective for them also. Most landowners are not going to be willing to put in grass waterways that look like this map all over their land. It's not feasible for farming, but it gives us areas of where we can look at. It helps us justify when we are putting practices in of why we are picking this area. I've seen waterways that show up on some of these maps. You get an engineer out there, you get it surveyed and everything, and they're like, you know, we can treat this with a sediment control basin. You work with the landowner, and it just helps you focus a little bit more. But it's not the be all to end all. So really target, again, is really, how do we fix and address the issue? And feasibility has to be part of it, not only for the landowner also. Conservation is a voluntary practice, and it should remain a voluntary practice. We have to make these practices feasible for the landowner, but we also need to be held accountable to using taxpayer dollars. And the time and resources needed. So you look back at this last slide I showed you, wetland restorations are a big thing that we want to have in our plan, but not all of these would have been financially feasible. It just shows a depression. It doesn't show you how much water it's going to store. We're not going to spend thousands of dollars on restoring a depression that isn't going to give us meaningful storage, whatever number you put in your plan that defines that meaningful storage. But again, feasibility is part of looking at all these. And, you can target a little bit more during your implementation phase, and we do it in our ranking process. So yeah, the map might say that you could put one there, but does it really have a cost benefit? How far is it from a waterway? When you have to tease out which projects you're actually going to do, part of that can be part of your implementation, where you target it even closer in and during a ranking process. I'll take any questions now if there is, and then I'm going to jump into measurable quick, which won't take too long. If anybody has any. Touch on measurable, and then we'll see if there's any questions after that. So you've heard measurable results. And really, on your measurable results, you really want to think about a few things. What is the desired future condition? And not only what is the desired future condition, but what is a realistic goal of that future condition? So putting your outcomes into the plan, it gets to be hard not to overreach. You don't want to underreach, but you don't want to set up some unrealistic goal that, we're going to fix everything in 5 years, because it's not going to happen. You want outcomes that can be measured directly. And so specifically, what do you want to accomplish and what can you accomplish in that time frame? Really, when you're looking at goals, you really want them to be measurable. It's easy to write in something, educate the public on how to conserve and protect our surface water resources. Okay, that sounds great. We all want to do that. But what does that really mean? how can you say at the end of the day that you accomplished that goal in your plan? You can specify in which way. Determine when your goal will be achieved and clarify why. So a more measurable goal, host 2 cover crop workshops for landowners per year, with 40% of workshop attendings enrolling in our cost share program. That's a measurable goal. At the end of the day, you can say whether you did that or not, whether that was achieved, if it was achieved at what success rate it was achieved at. So being clear on what those are. So here's an example out of our plan. On the far left, we have our management zones and watersheds. So these are our priority sub-watersheds that are broken up. And we have our action, what we're going to do in that area. So treat 2% of cropland with concentrated flow practices, implementing 100 practices such as wascobs, waterways, terraces, treating 10 acres per BMP. At the end of the day, I can answer whether that was done. When a practice is put in, it comes back with what the reductions of sediment were, what the reductions of, how many acres treated, everything like that. I can answer whether we achieved that goal or where we missed the mark, which you're not going to achieve every goal, but that's going to help shape the next plan. I'm going to go here and then ask for questions. So really, overall, you really want your plan to be, it needs to be dynamic, it needs to be adaptable, realistic, should be able to be understandable, and of course, prioritize, targeted, and measurable. And there isn't a starting point and ending spot. You're going to set your priorities and your goals. You're going to implement, hopefully, and actually get some stuff done and on the ground. You're going to have to measure those things, whether it's by modeling or whether it's by doing your next wraps and getting real world data. And you're going to have to adjust and adapt. What's your priority today may not be your priority 2 years from now, or 5 years, or 10 years. Hopefully 10 years from now, large improvements will have been made in some areas. You're going to look at the watershed and what changes you've made. And then we're going to start this again. We're going to receive input. We're going to keep working together as a group, and we're going to set more priorities and goals. Okay, I'm a little bit early, but not too bad. Does anybody have any questions?
There is a question in the chat.
Expand on something, I'd be happy to. Yes, I can pull it up. Have you secured money for this? So we have seen, so we have gotten our watershed-based funding, the clean water funds. We have gotten that. We have also seen federal funds that have come to us that we would not have had if we did not have this comprehensive water plan. And we were able to get RCPP funds and which is what? Regional Conservation Planning Partnership. And we have gotten funds that have come to us. So an example is we have only 2 recreational lakes in our area. So protecting those lakes were a priority. One was actually delisted off of the impaired waters list. I want to say it was over 10 years ago, but right around 10 years ago. And one is just becoming more impaired. And so we actually got a grant to put about 700 acres of cover crops in that small lakes watershed. That was federal funds that we brought into that area. It was $174,000. And if it hadn't been for this plan and for that sub watershed, to be prioritized as a area of interest in this water, in our overall larger watershed, there's no way we would have been picked for that funding. So having these thought out and written well is going to really make a difference later. And it's going to help a lot when it comes to implementation. Because this is kind of your roadmap. When you're going to sit down later, and I'll be talking about implementation after lunch, and it's going to be, okay, well, we have a plan. Now, where do we start? Referring back to your plan and looking at, well, what did we say we're going to do? That's really going to help you start your implementation plan. Because there's not enough funding out there to just go ahead and start doing everything you want in your plan. It's just the reality. So yes, it has made a difference.
So maybe to build on that, Michelle, and address Maury's question, through the state clean water funds, we have Bowser set up, created a program, and this is also out of the recommendation with the local government water roundtable for watershed-based funding that is on a non-competitive allocation basis. And so we have the watershed-based implementation funding program that is funded through Clean Water Fund dollar, or with Clean Water Fund dollars. And as the watershed partnerships have your local comprehensive plans approved by the Bowser board and locally adopted, then each of the watershed partnerships is allocated a portion of the Clean Water Fund dollars that Bowser receives to use towards implementation of your plan. And that doesn't, certainly, as Michelle said, fund your whole plan, but it's to help start to implement those plans. And it's based on land area, percentage of the amount of public water that's within each of the watersheds, private land that's within the watersheds, and the formula. It's a formula-based allocation, so that it's trying to achieve an equal distribution based on largely watershed size and resources that the partners can implement. And as Michelle said, that's then been able to be used as a way to leverage additional sources of funds. And the RCPP program and the funds that Michelle mentioned, that's a benefit of this collaborative partnership. That's through the NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service. They work very closely with soil and water conservation districts, and with the partnership, then they can put in through those grants that way. In other areas, they're looking at ways to maybe work with, up on the North Shore of the Great Lakes, work with EPA on Great Lakes Initiative funds. In the Mississippi headwaters area, they've worked a lot, and we've worked with DNR to bring in U.S. Forest Service dollars for forestry management and restoration work. So the state funds are available once the plan is approved and adopted, that will help move towards implementation.
Yep. Thank you, Kevin. I thought that it might be easier to speak out rather than type it in. Thank you, Michelle, as well. Yeah, as you know, Kevin, we are in the process of developing our One Watershed One plan. And my question was mostly toward the answer that I received from Michelle, because I know how the Bowser Clean Water Fund is going to be distributed, but rather because this One Watershed One plan is going to replace our historically 10-year watershed management plan. And I was just wondering how this would work to secure some either federal or state from other sources other than Clean Water Fund toward the prioritized goals. And I think that's, I got my answer. Thank you, though.
I had somebody ask me, looks like I have just a minute, that we stated that plans should be adaptable. And can the plan be adjusted without going through a formal process like a plan update must go through? Yes and no. So your plan completely if you're going to change what you've stated is your priority resource concerns or what your priority areas are, those are stated in your plan. And those, if you want to adjust those, then you're going to have to do a plan amendment and go through that process. Now, but every grant, we do a work plan. And we say exactly specifically in that work plan. So it's almost kind of, you know, you're even targeting and narrowing down maybe just a little bit more. And those work plans can be adjusted. If you're changing a lot of dollar amounts or anything, you know, you still got to go through your board conservationist and all that stuff, but they'll help you walk through any of that stuff. I don't know if that answered, but otherwise, that's all I have. And it's noon.
All right, thank you, Michelle. And if there aren't any other questions, then we'll go to lunch and we will see everyone back here at 1 to hear about project and program implementation from Michelle. Thank you.